Chapter 4. They spread out and started north. Wesker and Chris behind and to Barry's left, Jill and Joseph on his right. Directly in front of them was a sparse stand of trees, and as the Alpha's copter blade revved down, Jill could smell burning fuel and see wisps of smoke curling through the foliage. They moved quickly through the wooded area, visibility dropping off sharply beneath the needled branches. The warm scents of pine and earth were overshadowed by the burning smell, the acrid odor growing stronger with each step. From the dim light filtering towards them, Jill saw that there was another clearing ahead, high with brittle grasses. "I see it, dead ahead!" Jill felt her heart speed up at Barry's shout, and then they were all running, hurrying to catch up to their point man. She emerged from the copse of trees, Joseph next to her. Barry was already at the down copter, Chris and Wesker right behind. Smoke was still rising from the silent wreck, but it was thinning. There had been a fire, it had died out. She and Joseph reached the others and stopped, staring, no one speaking as they surveyed the scene. The long, wide body of the copter was intact, not a single scratch visible. The port landing rail looked bent, but besides that and the dying haze of smoke from the rotor, there seemed to be nothing wrong with it. The hatches stood open, the beam from Wesker's penlight showing them an undamaged cabin. From what she could see, most of Bravo's gear was still on board. So where are they? It didn't make any sense. It hadn't been 15 minutes since their last transmission. If anyone had been injured, they would have stayed. If they decided to leave, why had they left their equipment behind? Wesker handed the light to Joseph and nodded towards the cockpit. "Check it out. The rest of you spread out. Look for clues. Tracks, shell casings, signs of struggle. You find anything, let me know. And stay alert." Jill stood a moment longer, staring at the smoking copter, and wondering what could have happened. Enrico had said something about a malfunction. So, okay, the Bravos had set down. What had happened next? What would have made them abandon their best chance of being found, leaving behind emergency kits, weaponry? Jill saw a couple of bulletproof vests crumpled next to the hatch and shook her head, adding it to the growing list of seemingly irrational actions. She turned to join the search as Joseph stepped out of the cockpit, looking as confused as she felt. She waited to hear his report as he handed the light back to Wesker, shrugging nervously. "I don't know what happened. The bent rail suggests a forced landing, but except for the electrical system, everything looks fine." Wesker sighed, then raised his voice so the others could hear. "Circle out, people. 3 meters apart. Widen as we go." Jill moved over to stand between Chris and Barry, both men already scanning the ground at their feet as they slowly moved east and northeast of the helicopter. Wesker stepped into the cabin, probing the darkness with his penlight. Joseph headed west. Dry weeds crackled underfoot as they widened their circle, the only sound in the still, warm air except for the distant hum of the Alpha helicopter engine. Jill used her boots to search through the thick ground cover, brushing the tall grasses aside with each step. In another few moments, it'd be too dark to see anything. They needed to break out the flashlights. Bravo had left theirs behind. Jill stopped suddenly, listening. The sighing, crackling steps of the others, the faraway drone of their copter, and nothing else. Not a chirp, a chitter, nothing. They were in the woods in the middle of summer. Where were the animals, the insects? The forest was unnaturally still, the only sounds human. For the first time since they'd sat down, Jill was afraid. She was about to call out to the others when Joseph shouted from somewhere behind them, his voice high and cracking. "Hey! Over here!" Jill turned and started jogging back, saw Chris and Barry do the same. Wesker was still by the helicopter and had drawn his weapon at Joseph's cry, porting it up as he broke into a run. In the murky light, Jill could just make out Joseph's shadowy form, crouched down in the high grass near some trees 100 feet past the copter. Instinctively, she pulled her own sidearm and double-timed, suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of encroaching doom. Joseph stood up, holding something, let out a strangled scream before dropping it, his eyes wide with horror. For a split second, Jill's mind couldn't accept what it had been in Joseph's grasp. A Star's handgun. A Beretta. Jill ran faster, catching up to Wesker. And a disembodied human hand curled around it, hacked off at the wrist. There was a deep, guttural snarl from behind Joseph, from the darkness of the trees. an animal growling, joined by another rasping, throaty shriek. And suddenly, dark, powerful shapes erupted from the woods, lunging at Joseph and taking him down. "Joseph!" Gil's scream ringing in his ears. Chris drew his weapon and stopped in his tracks, trying to get a clear shot at the raging beasts that were attacking Joseph. Wesker's penlight sent a thin beam dancing over the writhing creatures, illuminating a nightmare. Joseph's body was all but hidden by the three animals that tore at him, ripping at him with gnashing, dripping jaws. They were the size and shape of dogs, as big as German shepherds maybe, except that they seemed to have no fur, no skin. Wet, red sinew and muscle flashed beneath Wesker's wavering light, dog creatures shrieking and snapping in a frenzy of bloodlust. Joseph cried out, a burbling, liquid sound as he flailed weakly at his savage attackers, blood pouring from multiple wounds. It was the scream of a dying man. There was no time to waste. Chris targeted and opened fire. 3 rounds smacked wetly into one of the dogs, a 4th shot going high. There was a single, high-pitched yelp, and the beast went down, its sides heaving. The other 2 animals continued their assault, indifferent to the thunderous shots. Even as Chris watched in horror, one of the slavering cowhounds lunged forward and ripped out Joseph's throat, exposing bloody gristle and the glistening slickness of bone. The stars opened up, sending a rain of explosive fire at Joseph's killers. Red splatters burst into the air, the dog things still trying to get at the spasming corpse, while bullets riddled their strange flesh. With a final series of harsh, barking mules, they fell, and didn't rise again. "Hold your fire!" Chris took his finger off the trigger, but continued to point the handgun at the fallen creatures, ready to blow apart the first one that so much as twitched. 2 of them were still breathing, growling softly through panting gasps. The 3rd sprawled lifelessly next to Joseph's mutilated body.
"They should be dead. They should have stayed down at the first shots. What are they?"
Wesker took a single step towards the slaughter in front of them, when all around, deep, echoing howls filled the warm night air, shrill voices of predatorial fury coming at the stars from all directions. "Back to the copter! Now!" Chris ran, Barry and Jill in front of him and Wesker bringing up the rear. The 4 of them sprinted through the dark trees, unseen branches slapping at them as the howls grew louder, more insistent. Wesker turned and fired blindly into the woods as they stumbled towards the waiting helicopter, its blades already spinning. Chris felt relief sweep through him. Brad must have heard the shots. They still had a chance. Chris could hear the creatures behind them now, the sharp rustling of lean, muscular bodies staring through the trees. He could also see Brad's pale, wide-eyed face through the glass front of the copter, the reflected lights of the control panel casting a greenish glow across his panicked features. He was shouting something, but the roar of the engine drowned out everything now, the blast of wind turning the field into a rippling sea. Another 50 feet. Almost there. Suddenly, the helicopter jerked into the air, accelerating wildly. Chris caught a final glimpse of Brad's face and could see the blind terror there, the unthinking panic that had gripped him as he clawed at the controls. "No! Don't go!" But the wobbling rails were already out of reach. The copter pitched forward and away from them through the thundering darkness. They were going to die. "Damn you, Vickers!" Wesker turned and fired again, and was rewarded with a squeal of pain from one of their pursuers. There were at least 4 more close behind, gaining on them rapidly. "Keep going!" He tried to get his bearings as they stumbled on, the piercing shrieks of the mutant dogs urging them to go faster. The sound of the helicopter was dying away, cowardly Vickers taking their escape with them. Wesker fired again, the shot going wide, saw another shadowy form join the hunt. The dogs were brutally fast. They didn't stand a chance, unless... Marshall. "They're right. 1 o'clock. They couldn't outrun the creatures, but maybe they could keep them at bay long enough to reach cover. He spun and fired the last round in his clip. "Empty!" Ejecting the spent magazine, he fumbled for another one tucked into his belt as both Barry and Chris took up the defense, firing past him into the closing pack. Wesker slapped in the fresh clip as they reached the edge of the overgrown clearing and plunged into another dark stand of trees. They stumbled and dodged through the woods, tripping on uneven ground as the killer dogs came on. Lungs aching for air, Wesker imagined that he could smell the fetid, rotting meat stench of the beasts as they narrowed the distance. And he somehow found the capacity to run faster. Should be there by now. Gotta be close. Chris saw it first through the thinning shadows of the trees, the looming monstrosity backlit by a blue moon. There! Run for that house! It looked abandoned from the outside, the weathered wood and stone of the giant mansion crumbling in dark. The full size of the structure was cloaked by the shadowy, overgrown hedges that surrounded it, isolating it from the forest. A massive outset front porch presented double doors, the only option for escape. Wesker actually heard the snap of powerful jaws behind him and fired at the sound, intuitively squeezing the trigger as he ran for the front of the mansion. Gurgling yelp, and the creature fell away, the howls of its siblings louder than ever, raised to a fever pitch by the thrill of the chase. Jill reached the doors first, slamming into the heavy wood with one shoulder as she snatched at the handles. Amazingly, they crashed open. Brightness spilled out across the stone steps of the porch, lighting their path. She turned and started firing, providing cover as the three gasping men ran for the opening in the darkness. They piled into the mansion, Jill diving in last and Barry throwing his considerable bulk against the door, wedging it closed against the snarls of the creatures. He collapsed against it, face red and sweating as Chris found the entry steel deadbolt and slid it home. They'd made it. Outside, dogs howled and scrabbled uselessly at the heavy door. Wesker took a deep breath of the cool, quiet air that filled the well-lit room and exhaled sharply. As he'd already known, Spencer House wasn't abandoned. Now that they were here, all his careful planning was for nothing. Wesker silently cursed Brad Vickers again. Wondered if they were any better off inside than out. Chapter 5. Jill took in their new surroundings as she caught her breath, feeling like she was a character in a nightmare that had just turned into a grand fantasy. Wild, howling monsters, Joseph's sudden death, a terrifying run through the dark woods, and now this.
Deserted, huh?
It was a palace, pure and simple, what her father would have called a perfect score. The room they had escaped into was the epitome of lavish. It was huge, easily bigger than Jill's entire house, tiled in gray-flecked marble and dominated by a wide, carpeted staircase that led to a second-floor balcony. Arched marble pillars lined the ornate hall, supporting the dark, heavy wood balustrade of the upper floor. Fluted wall sconces cast funnels of light across walls of cream, trimmed in oak and offset by the deep burnt ochre of the carpeting. In short, it was magnificent. What is this? No one answered him. Jill took a deep breath and decided immediately that she didn't like it. There was a sense of wrongness to the vast room, an atmosphere of vague oppression. It felt haunted somehow, though by who or what, she couldn't say.
Beats the hell out of getting eaten by mutant dogs, though. Gotta give it that much. God, poor Joseph!
There hadn't been time to mourn him, and there wasn't time now, but he would be missed. She walked towards the stairs, clutching her handgun, footsteps muffled by the plush carpet that led from the front door. There was an antique typewriter on a small table to the right of the steps, a blank sheet of paper spooled in the works. A strange bit of decorum. The expansive hall was otherwise empty. She turned back towards the others, wondering what their take on all of this was. Barry and Chris both looked uncertain, their faces flushed and sweaty as they surveyed the room. Wesker was crouched by the front door, examining one of the latches. He stood up, stark shade still in place, seeming as detached as ever. The wood around the lock is splintered. Somebody broke this door open before we got here. Chris looked hopeful. Maybe the Bravos? Wesker nodded. That's what I'm thinking. Help should be on the way, assuming our friend, Mr. Vickers, bothered to call it in. His voice dripped sarcasm, and Jill felt her own anger kindling. Brad had screwed up big time. It almost cost them their lives. There was no excuse for what he'd done. Wesker continued, walking across the room towards one of the two doors on the west wall. He rattled the handle, but it didn't open. It's not safe to go back out. Until the cavalry shows up, we might as well take a look around. It's obvious that somebody's been keeping this place up. The why and for how long. How are we set for ammo? Jill ejected the clip from her Beretta and counted. 3 rounds left, plus 2 loaded magazines on her belt. 33 shots. Chris had 22 left, Wesker 17. Barry had 2 racked speed loaders for his Colt, plus an extra handful of loose cartridges tucked into a hip pouch. 19 rounds in all. Jill thought about all they'd left back on the helicopter and felt another rush of anger towards Brad. Boxes of ammunition, flashlights, walkie-talkies, shotguns, not to mention medical supplies. That Beretta that Joseph had found out in the field, that pale, blood-splattered finger still wrapped around it. The STARS team member dead or dying. Thanks to Brad, they didn't even have a band-aid to offer. The sound of something heavy sliding to the floor somewhere close by. In unison, they turned towards the single door on the east wall. Jill was suddenly reminded of every horror movie she'd ever seen. A strange house, a strange noise. She shivered and decided that she was most definitely going to kick Brad's narrow ass when they got out of here. Chris, check it out and report back ASAP. We'll wait here in case the RPD comes knocking. Run into any trouble, fire your weapon, and we'll find you. Chris nodded and started towards the door, his boots clacking loudly against the marble floor. Jill felt that sense of foreboding wash over her again.
Chris?
His hand on the knob, he turned back, and she realized that there was nothing she could tell him that made any sense. Everything was happening so fast. There was so much wrong with the situation that she didn't know where to start.
And he's a trained professional, and so are you. Start acting like it.
Take care. It wasn't what she wanted to say, but it would have to be enough.
Chris gave her a lopsided grin, then raised his Beretta and stepped through the doorway. Jill heard the ticking of a clock, and then he was gone, closing the door behind him. Barry caught her gaze and smiled at her, looked that told her not to worry. But Jill couldn't shake the sudden certainty that Chris wouldn't be coming back. Chris swept the room, taking in the stately elegance of the environment as he realized he was alone. Whoever made that noise, they weren't here.
The solemn ticking of a grandfather clock filled the cool air, echoing off of shining black and white tiles. He was in a dining hall, the kind he'd only ever seen in movies about rich people. Like the front room, this one had an incredibly high ceiling and a second-floor balcony, but it was also decorated with expensive-looking art and had an inset fireplace at the far end, complete with a coat of arms and crossed swords hung over the mantel. There didn't seem to be any way to get to the second floor, but there was a closed door to the right of the fireplace.
Chris lowered his weapon and started for the door, still awed by the wealth of the abandoned mansion that the STARS had stumbled into. The dining room had polished redwood trim and expensive-looking artwork on the beige stucco walls, surrounding a long wooden table that ran the length of the room. The table had to seat at least 20, though it was only set for a handful of people. Judging from the dust on the lacy placemats, nothing had been served for weeks. Except no one is supposed to have been here for 30 years, let alone hosting a formal dinner. Spencer had this place closed down before anyone ever stayed here. Chris shook his head. Obviously, someone had reopened it a long time ago. So how was it that everyone in Raccoon City believed the Spencer estate to be boarded up, a crumbling ruin out in the woods? More importantly, why had Umbrella lied to Irons about its condition? Murders, disappearances, Umbrella, Jill. It was frustrating. He felt like he had some of the answers, but wasn't sure what questions to ask. He reached the door and turned the knob slowly, listening for any sound of movement on the other side. He couldn't hear anything over the ticking old clock. It was set against the wall, and each movement of the second hand reverberated hollowly, amplified by the cavernous room. The door opened into one side of a narrow corridor, dimly lit by antique light fixtures. Chris quickly checked both directions. To the right was maybe 10 meters of hardwood hall, a couple of doors across from him, and a door at the end of the corridor. To the left, the hallway took a sharp turn away from where he stood, widening out. He saw the edge of a patterned brown rug on the floor there. He wrinkled his nose, frowning. There was a vague odor in the air, a faint scent of something unpleasant, something familiar. He stood in the doorway another moment, trying to place the smell. One summer when he was a kid, the chain had come off his bike when he'd been out for a ride with some friends. He'd ended up in a ditch about 6 inches away from a choice bit of roadkill. The dried up, pulpy remains of what once might have been a woodchuck. Time and the summer heat had dissipated the worst of the stink. The what had remained had been bad enough. Much to the amusement of his buddies, he'd vomited his lunch all over the carcass, taken a deep breath, then puked again. He still remembered the sun-baked scent of drying rot, like thickly soured milk and bile. The same smell that lingered in the corridor now like a bad dream. A soft, shuffling noise from behind the first door to his right, like a padded fist sliding across the wall. There was someone on the other side. Chris edged into the hallway and moved towards the door, careful not to turn his back to the unsecured area. As he got closer, gentle sounds of movement stopped, and he could see that the door wasn't closed all the way.
No time like the present.
With an easy tap, the door swung inward into a dim hall with green-flecked wallpaper. A broad-shouldered man was standing not 20 feet away, half hidden in shadow, his back to Chris. He turned around slowly, careful shuffling of someone drunk or injured, and the smell that Chris had noticed before came off of the man in thick, noxious waves. His clothes were tattered and stained, the back of his head patched with sparse, scraggly hair.
Gotta be sick. Maybe dying.
Whatever was wrong with him, Chris didn't like it. His instincts were screaming at him to do something. He stepped into the corridor and trained his Beretta on the man's torso. "Hold it! Don't move!" The man completed his turn and started towards Chris, shambling forward into the light. Its face was deathly pale, except for the blood smeared around its rotting lips. Flaps of dried skin hung from its sucking cheeks, and the dark wells of the creature's eye sockets glittered with hunger as it reached out with skeletal hands. Chris fired 3 shots that smacked into the creature's upper chest in a fine spray of crimson. With a gasping moan, crumpled to the floor, dead. Chris staggered back, his thoughts racing in time with his hammering heart. He hit the door with one shoulder, was vaguely aware that it latched closed behind him as he stared at the fallen, stinking heap.
Dead. That thing's the walking goddamn dead.
The cannibal attacks the raccoon, all of them near the forest. He'd seen enough late-night movies to know what he was looking at, but he still couldn't believe it.
Zombies.
No. No way. That was fiction. But maybe some kind of a disease mimicking the symptoms. He had to tell the others. He turned and grabbed at the handle, but the heavy door wouldn't move. It must have locked itself when he'd stumbled behind him. A wet movement. Chris spun, eyes wide as the twitching creature clawed at the wooden floor, pulling itself towards him in an eager, single-minded silence. Chris realized that it was drooling, and the sight of the sticky pink rivulets pulling to the floor finally spurred him into action. He fired again, 2 shots into the thing's decaying, upturned face. Dark holes opened up in its knobby skull, sending tiny rivers of fluid and fleshy tissue through its lower jaw. With a heavy sigh, the rotting thing settled to the floor in a spreading red lake. Chris didn't want to make any bets on it staying down. He gave one more futile yank on the door and then stepped carefully past the body, moving down the corridor. He rattled the handle of a door on his left, but it was locked. There was a tiny etching in the key plate, what looked like a sword. He filed that bit of information into his confused, swirling thoughts, and continued on, gripping the Beretta tightly. There was an offshoot to his right with a single door, but he ignored it, wanting to find a way to circle back to the front hall. The others must have heard the shots, but he had to assume that there were more creatures running around here, like the one he'd killed. The rest of the team might already have their hands full. There was a door at the end of the hall on the left, where the corridor turned. Chris hurried towards it, the putrid scent of the creature,
The zombie, call it what it is.
making him want to gag. As he neared the door, he realized that the smell was actually getting worse, intensifying with each step. He heard the soft, hungry moan as his hand touched the knob, even as it registered that he only had 2 bullets left in his clip. In the shadows to his right, movement.
Gotta reload. Get somewhere safe.
Chris jerked the door open and stepped into the arms of the shambling creature that waited on the other side, its peeling fingers grasping at him as it lunged for his throat. 3 shots. Seconds later, 2 more. It sounds distant but distinct in the palatial lobby.
Chris!
Jill, why don't you? I'm going too. Chris wouldn't waste shots like that unless he had to. He needed help. Wesker relented quickly, nodding. Go. I'll wait here. Barry opened the door, Jill right behind. They walked into a huge dining room, not as wide as the front hall, but at least as long. There was another door at the opposite end, past a grandfather clock that ticked loudly in the frigid, dusty air. Barry jogged towards it, revolver in hand, feeling tense and worried. Christ, what a balls-up operation this was. Star teams were often sent into risky situations where the circumstances were unusual, but this was the first time since he'd been a rookie that Barry felt like things had gone totally out of control. Joseph was dead. Chickenheart Vickers had left them to be eaten by dogs from hell. Now Chris was in trouble. Wesker shouldn't have sent him in alone. Jill reached the door first, touching the handle with slim fingers and looking to him. Barry nodded, and she pushed it open, going in low and left. Barry took the other side, both of them sweeping an empty corridor.
Chris?
There was no answer. Barry scowled, sniffing the air. Something smelled like rotting fruit. I'll check the doors. Jill nodded and edged to the left, alert and focused. Barry moved towards the first door, feeling good that Jill was at his back. He thought she was kind of bitchy when she first transferred. She was proving to be a bright and capable soldier. Welcome addition to the Alphas. Ah! Jill let out a high-pitched gasp of surprise and Barry spun. The scent of decay suddenly thick in the narrow hall. Jill was backing away from an opening at the end of the corridor. Her weapon trained on something Barry couldn't see. Stop! Her voice was high and shaky, her expression horrified. She fired once, twice, still backing towards Barry, breathing fast and shallow. Get clear! Left! He raised the Colt as she moved out of the way, as a tall man stepped into view. The figure's arms were stretched out like a sleepwalker's, the hands frail and grasping. Barry saw the creature's face then and didn't hesitate. He fired, the .357 round peeling the top of its ashen skull away in an explosive burst, blood coursing down its strange, terrible features, staining the cataracts of its pale, rolling eyes. He pitched back, sprawling face up at Jill's feet. Barry hurried to her side, stunned. What? Then he saw what was on the carpet in front of them, laying in the small sitting area that marked the end of the corridor. For a moment, Barry thought it was Chris, until he saw the Stars Bravo insignia on the vest, felt a different kind of horror set in as he struggled to recognize the features. The Bravo had been decapitated, the head laying a foot away from the corpse, the face completely covered in gore. Oh, jeez. It's Ken. Kenneth Sullivan. One of the best field scouts Barry had ever known, and a hell of a nice guy. There was a gaping, ragged wound in his chest. Chunks of partly eaten tissue and guts strewn about the bloody hole. His left hand was missing, and there was no weapon nearby. It must have been the gun that Joseph had found out in the woods. Barry looked away, sickened. Ken had been a quiet, decent sort. Did a lot of work in chemistry. He had a teenage son who lived with his ex in California. Barry thought of his own girls at home, Moira and Polly. He felt a surge of helpless fear for them. He wasn't afraid of death, but the thought of them growing up without a father. Jill dropped into a crouch next to his ravaged body and rifled quickly through the belt pack. She shot an apologetic look at Barry, but he gave her a slight nod. They needed the ammo. Ken certainly didn't. She came up with 2 clips for a 9mm and tucked them into her hip pocket. Barry turned and stared down at Ken's murderer in disgust and wonder. He had no doubt that he was looking at one of the cannibal killers that had been preying upon Raccoon City. It had a crusty scum of red around its mouth and gore-encrusted nails, as well as a ragged shirt that was stiff with dried blood. What was weird was how dead it looked. Barry had once done a covert hostage rescue in Ecuador, where a group of farmers had been held for weeks by a band of insane guerrilla rebels. Several of the hostages had been killed early in the siege, and after the Stars managed to capture the rebels, Barry had gone with one of the survivors to record the deaths. 4 victims had been shot, their bodies dumped behind the small wooden shack that the rebels had taken over. After 3 weeks in the South American sun, skin on their faces had shriveled, the cracking, lined flesh pulling away from sinew and bone. He still remembered those faces clearly, saw them again now that he looked down at the fallen creature. It wore the face of death, besides of which it smelled like a slaughterhouse on a hot day. Somebody forgot to tell those guys that dead people don't walk around. He could see the same sickened confusion on Jill's face, same questions in her eyes, but for now there weren't any answers. They had to find Chris and regroup. Together, they moved back down the corridor and checked all 3 doors, rattling handles and pushing at the heavy wood frames. All were securely locked. Chris had to have gone through one of them. There's nowhere else he could have gone. It didn't make sense. Short of breaking the doors down, there was nothing they could do about it.
We should report this to Wesker.
Barry nodded agreement. If they'd stumbled into the hiding place of the killers, they were going to need a plan of attack. They ran back through the dining room, stale air a relief from the corridor's reek of blood and decay. They reached the door back to the main hall and hurried through, Barry wondering what the captain would make of all this. It was downright... Barry stopped short, searching the elegant, empty hall, feeling like the butt of some practical joke that simply wasn't funny. Wesker was gone. Chapter 6. Wesker! Captain Wesker! He jogged towards a row of arches at the back of the hall, calling to Jill over his shoulder as he ran. Don't leave the room! Jill walked to the stairs, feeling almost dizzy. First Chris, now the captain. They hadn't been gone 5 minutes, and he'd said he was going to stay put. Why would he have left? She looked around for signs of a struggle. Spent cartridge, spot of blood. There was nothing to indicate what might have happened. Barry appeared on the other side of the giant staircase, shaking his head, and walking slowly to join her. Jill bit her lower lip, frowning.
You think Wesker ran into one of those... things?
I don't think the RPD showed and snuck him out. Though if he did run into trouble, he would have heard the shots.
Not necessarily. He could have been ambushed, dragged away.
They stood silently for a moment, thinking. Jill was still a bit shaken from the face-to-face with the walking corpse. Thought she'd accepted the facts pretty well. The woods bordering Raccoon City had become infested with zombies.
After a lifetime of reading trashy novels about serial killers, is a cannibal zombie really so hard to swallow?
Somehow it wasn't, and neither were the murderous dogs or the secretly kept estate. There was no question that it all existed. The question was, why? Did the mansion have anything to do with the murders? Or had the zombies simply overrun it like they'd overrun Raccoon Forest?
And was that creature the last thing Becky and Pris saw?
She rejected the thought almost violently. Thinking about the girls now would be a mistake.
So do we go looking, or do we wait?
Go looking. Tim made it here. The rest of the Bravos could be somewhere in this house. Be easy enough to get lost. Chris... He half smiled, though Jill could see the worry in his eyes. Chris and Wesker got sidetracked, but we'll find them. Take more than a couple of walking stiffs to cause either of them grief. He reached into a pocket in his vest and pulled out something wrapped in a handkerchief, handing it to her. She felt the thin metal objects beneath the light fabric and recognized them instantly. It's the set you gave me to practice with last month. I figured you'll have better luck with them. Jill nodded, tucking the lockpicks into her hip pouch. Barry had taken an interest in her former career, and she'd given him a few pieces from her old set, several picks and torsion bars. They could come in handy. A small bundle settled on top of something hard and smooth.
Trent's computer!
In all the excitement, she'd totally forgotten about her strange encounter in the locker room. She opened her mouth to tell Barry, then shut it, remembering Trent's cryptic warning.
I wouldn't mention this conversation to anyone.
Screw that. She'd almost risked it anyway with Chris.
And where is Chris now? Who's to say that Trent's dire consequences haven't already occurred?
Jill realized what she was thinking and had to fight off an urge to laugh at herself. What had happened with Trent probably wasn't even relevant to their predicament, and whether or not she could trust Barry, she knew she didn't trust Trent. Still, she decided not to say anything about it, at least until she had a chance to see what the computer held. I think we should split up. I know it's dangerous, but we need to cover a lot of ground. If we find anybody, we meet back here. Use this room as a base. Rubbing at his beard, he fixed her with a serious gaze. You up for this, Jill? We could search together.
No, you're right. I can take the West Wing.
Unlike cops, stars seldom partnered. They were trained to watch their own backs in dangerous situations. Barry nodded. Okay, I'll go back and see if I can persuade one of those doors to open. Keep an eye out for a back exit, conserve ammo, and be careful.
You too.
Barry grinned, holding up his Colt Python. I'll be fine. There was nothing left to say. Jill headed straight for the set of doors on the west wall that Wesker hadn't tried earlier. Behind her, Barry hurried back to the dining room. She heard the door open and close, leaving her alone.
Here goes nothing.
The painted blue doors opened smoothly, revealing a small, shadowy room as cool and silent as the main hall, all in shades of blue. Muted track lighting illuminated framed paintings on dusky walls, and in the center of the room was a large statue of a woman holding an urn on one shoulder. Jill closed the door behind her and let her eyes adjust to the gloom, noting the two doors opposite the one she'd come through. The one on the left was open, though a small chest was pushed in front of it, blocking access. It was unlikely that Wesker had gone that way. She walked to the one on the right and tried the knob. Locked. Sighing, she reached into her pack for the picks, then hesitated, feeling the smooth weight of the mini disc reader.
Let's see what Mr. Trent thinks is so important.
She slipped it out and studied it a moment, then tapped the switch. A screen the size of a baseball card flickered to life. With a few more taps, small lines of type scrolled across the monitor. She scanned the material, recognizing the names and dates from local newspapers. Trent had apparently compiled every article he could find about the murders and disappearances in Raccoon, plus the pieces on the stars.
Nothing new here.
Jill skipped along, wondering what the point was. After the articles was a list of names. William Birkin, Steve Keller, Michael Dees, John Howe, Martin Crackhorn, Henry Sarton, Ellen Smith, Bill Rabbitson. She frowned. None of the names were familiar, except... Wasn't Bill Rabbitson Chris's friend? The one who had worked for Umbrella? She couldn't be sure. She'd have to ask Chris, assuming we could find him. This was a waste of time. She needed to start looking for the other stars. She pressed the forwarding key to get to the end of the data, and a picture appeared. Tiny lines set into patterns. There were squares and long rectangles, crosshatched with smaller marks that connected the empty boxes. Beneath it was a single line, a message as enigmatic as she could have expected from Mr. Trent. Night Keys, Tiger Eyes, 4 crests, Gate of New Life, East Eagle, West Wolf.
Gee, how illuminating. That just clears up everything, doesn't it?
The picture was some kind of a map, she decided. It looked like a floor plan. The biggest area was at the center, a slightly smaller one extending off to the left. Jill suddenly felt her heart skip a beat. She stared down at the small screen, wondering how Trent had known. It was the mansion's first floor. She tapped the forward button again and saw what could only be the second floor, the shapes corresponding to the first map. There was nothing after the second map, but it was enough. As far as she was concerned, there was no longer any question that the Spencer estate was the source of the terror in Raccoon City, which meant that the answer was here, waiting to be uncovered. The zombie groaned as Chris fired point blank into its gut twice. Shots were muffled by its rancid flesh, and it fell against him, expelling a rush of foul, stinking air across his face. Chris pushed it away, the back of his throat locking. His hands and the barrel of his weapon were dripping with sticky fluids. The creature collapsed to the floor, its limbs spasming. Chris backed away, wiping the Beretta against his vest as he took deep breaths, trying desperately not to vomit. The zombie out in the hall had been a desiccated mess, shriveled and dry. This one was... fresh, if that was the right word. Festering, necrotic, wet. He swallowed hard. The urge to throw up slowly passed. He didn't have a particularly weak stomach, but that smell, God! Keep it together. Could be more of them. The hall he'd entered was all dark wood and dim light. For the moment, there was no sound except the pulse of blood in his ears. He looked down at the body, wondering exactly what it was, what it had been. He had felt its hot, fetid breath against his skin. It was a reanimated corpse, no matter what it looked like. He decided it didn't matter. For all intents and purposes, it was a zombie. It had tried to bite him. Creatures like it had already chowed down on some of Raccoon's population. He needed to find his way back to the others, and they had to get out, get help. They didn't have the firepower to handle the situation alone. He ejected the empty clip from the gummy weapon and quickly reloaded, his chest tightening with stress. 15 rounds left. He had a Bowie knife, but the thought of going up against the zombie with only a knife wasn't all that appealing. There was a plain-looking door to his left. Chris pulled at the knob, but it was locked. He squinted at the key plate and wasn't all that surprised to see an etching of what looked like armor. Sword, armor, there was a definite theme developing. He moved down the wide hall, listening for any sound and taking frequent breaths through his nose. The goo on his vest and hands made it hard to tell if there were any more of them around. The smell was all over him, but it could be his only chance to avoid another close encounter. The hall turned to the left and he took the corner fast, sweeping the Beretta across the wide wooden expanse. There was a support pillar partially blocking his view, but he could see the back of a man just past it, the slumped shoulders and stained clothes of one of the creatures. Chris quickly edged to the right, trying to get a clear shot. The zombie was maybe 40 feet away, and he didn't want to waste his last rounds. At the sound of his boots against the hardwood floor, it turned, shuffling slowly. So slowly that Chris hesitated, watching the way it moved. This one seemed to have been dipped in a thin layer of slime, dull light reflecting off of its glistening skin as it stumbled almost blindly towards Chris. It slowly raised its arms, its pale, hairless skull wobbling on its emaciated neck. Silently, it shuffled forward. Chris took a sliding step back to his left, and the zombie changed direction, veering towards him eagerly, closing the distance between them at a slow walk.
Just like in the movies, dangerous but dumb, and easy to outrun.
He had to save ammo in case he got cornered. There were stairs at the end of the hall. Chris took a deep breath, readying himself. He stepped back, giving himself enough room to maneuver, and heard a gasping moan behind him. A fresh wave of rancid stink assaulting his senses. He spun, realization hitting him even before he saw it. The festering zombie was only a few feet away, reaching for him, bits of its putrid gut spilling out across its shattered abdomen. He hadn't killed it, hadn't waited long enough to make sure, and his stupidity was about to cost him. Ah, shit! Chris sprinted away and down the corridor, dodging both of them and cursing himself. He passed the thick support beam, almost to the stairs, and stopped cold, seeing what waited at the top. He caught only a glimpse of the ragged creature standing at the head of the stairs and spun away, raising his weapon to face the attackers that shambled towards him hungrily. From the shadows beneath the steps came a heavy, gurgling sigh and the scuffling of wood. Another one. He was trapped. There was no way he could kill them all. Door! It faced the side of the stairs, the dark wood blending in so well with the shadows that he almost hadn't seen it. Chris ran for it, grabbing the handle, praying that it would open as around him the creatures closed in. If it was locked, he was dead. Rebecca Chambers had never been more afraid, not once in her 18 years. For what seemed like an eternity, she'd listened to the soft scrape of rotting flesh brushing against the door, tried desperately to think of a plan, her dread building with each passing minute. There was no lock on the door. She'd lost her handgun on the run for the house. A small storage room, though well stocked with chemicals and stacks of paper, had offered nothing to use as defense except for a half-empty can of insect repellent. It was the can she gripped now, standing behind the door of the tiny room. If or when the monsters finally figured out how to use a doorknob, she planned on spraying it in their eyes and making a run for it.
Maybe they'll be laughing so hard I'll have a chance to slip past. Bug spray. Great weapon.
She'd heard what could have been gunshots somewhere close by, but they weren't repeated. Her hope that it was one of the team faded as the seconds ticked past. She was starting to give serious consideration to the concept that she was the only one left, when the door burst open and a gasping figure hurtled inside. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She leapt forward and pressed the button, releasing a cloud of chemical mist into its face, sensing herself to run past. It yelled and fell back against the door, slamming it shut, covered its eyes, sputtering. It wasn't a monster. She'd just maced one of the alphas. Oh no! Rebecca was already reaching into her field medical kit, her immense relief at seeing another of the stars battling with a monumental embarrassment. She fumbled out a clean cloth and a tiny squeezed bottle of water, stepping towards him.
Keep your eyes closed. Don't rub at them.
The alpha dropped his hands, face red. She finally recognized him. It was Chris Redfield, only the most attractive guy in the stars, not to mention her superior. She felt herself blush and was suddenly glad he couldn't see her.
Nice going, Rebecca. Way to make a great first impression on your first operation. Lose your gun, get lost, find a teammate.
She led him over to the small cot in the corner of the room and sat him down, letting her training take over.
Lean your head back. This is going to sting a little, but it's just water, okay?
She dabbed at his eyes with the damp cloth, relieved that she hadn't sprayed him with anything worse. What was that stuff? Tears and water streamed down his face, but there didn't seem to be any damage.
Bug repellent. The label's been ripped off, but the active ingredient is probably permethrin. It's an irritant, but the effect shouldn't last long. I lost my gun, and when you came in, I thought you were one of those things. Though if they haven't figured out how to use a doorknob by now, they probably won't.
She realized she was babbling and shut up, finishing the crude irrigation and stepping back. Chris wiped at his face and peered at her through bloodshot eyes. Rebecca Chambers, right? She nodded miserably.
Yeah. Look, I'm really sorry.
Don't worry about it. Not a bad weapon, actually. He stood up and looked around the small room, frowning. There wasn't much to see. An open trunk full of papers, a shelf lined with bottles of mostly unlabeled chemicals, a cot, and a desk. Rebecca had been through it all in her search for something to use against the creatures. What about the rest of your team? Rebecca shook her head.
I don't know. Something went wrong with the helicopter and we had to sit down. We were attacked by animals, some kind of dogs, and Enrico told us to run for cover.
She shrugged, suddenly feeling like she was about 12 years old.
I got turned around in the woods and ended up at the front door of this place. I think one of the others broke it down. It was open.
She trailed off, looking away from his intense gaze. The rest was probably obvious. She had no weapon, she'd gotten lost, she'd ended up here. All in all, a pretty poor showing. Hey, there's nothing else you could have done. Enrico said run, you ran. You followed orders. Those creatures out there, the zombies, they're all over the place. I got lost too, and the rest of the Alphas could be anywhere. Trust me, the fact that you made it this far. Outside, one of the monsters let out a low, plaintive wail. Chris stopped talking, his expression grim. Rebecca shuddered.
So, what do we do now?
We look for the others and try to find a way out. Except you don't have a gun and I'm almost out of ammo. Rebecca brightened and reached into her hip pack. She pulled out 2 full magazines and handed them over, pleased that she had something to offer.
Oh, and I found this on the desk.
She produced a silver key with a sword on it. She didn't know what it unlocked, but thought it might be useful. Chris stared at it thoughtfully, then slipped it into a pocket. He walked to the open trunk and looked down at the stacks of papers. He rifled through them, frowning. Your background's in biochemistry, right? Have you looked through these? Rebecca joined him, shaking her head.
Barely. I've been kind of busy watching the door.
He handed her one of the papers and she scanned it quickly. It was a list of neurotransmitters and level indicators.
Brain chemistry. But these numbers are all screwed up. Serotonin and norepinephrine are too low. But look here. The dopamine is off the chart. We're talking big-time schizo.
She noticed the incredulous look on his face and smiled a little. Being an 18-year-old college grad, she got a lot of that. Stars had recruited her right after graduation, promising her a whole team of researchers and a lab of her own to study molecular biology, her real passion. Provided, of course, that she went through basic training and got some field experience. No one else had shown much interest in hiring a whiz kid. There was a soft thump at the door and her smile faded. She was getting experience, all right. Chris fished the sword key out of his pocket and looked at her seriously. Past the door with a sword engraved over the keyhole. Going to go check it out. See if it leads back to the main hall. I want you to stay here and go through those files. Maybe there's something we can use. Her uncertainty must have shown in her face. He smiled gently, his voice low and soothing. I've got plenty of ammo thanks to you, and I won't be gone long. She nodded, making a conscious effort to relax. She was scared, but letting him see it wasn't going to help matters. He was probably scared too. He walked to the door, still talking. The RPD should be here any time, so if I don't come back right away, just wait here. He raised the weapon, putting his other hand on the knob. Get ready. As soon as I'm out, move the trunk in front of the door. I'll give a yell when I get back. Rebecca nodded again, and with a final quick smile, Chris opened the door and looked both ways before moving out into the hall. She closed the door and leaned against it, listening. After long seconds of silence, she heard the rattle of gunfire not far away. 5 or 6 shots, then nothing. After a few minutes, she moved the trunk to block part of the door, edging it in front of the hinges so she could push it out of the way easily. She knelt in front of it, trying to clear her thoughts as she started looking through the papers, trying not to feel as young and unsure as she felt. Sighing, she pulled out a handful of papers and started to read. Chapter 7. The lock was a piece of cake. 3 flat tumblers in a single row. Jill could have opened it with a couple of paper clips. According to the map, the door would open into a long hall. Sure enough. She took another long look at the computer screen, then slipped it into her pack, thinking. Looked like there was a back way out, through several halls and past a series of rooms. She could look for Wesker and the others along the way, maybe secure an escape route at the same time. She stepped into the narrow corridor, fully loaded Beretta in hand. It was a study in weirdness. The hall wasn't all that spectacular, the carpet runner and the wallpaper done in basic tans and browns, the wide windows showing only the darkness outside. The display crests that lined the inner wall, however, there were 3 of them, each topped by a small lamp, and each prominently displaying a wide array of bleached human bones on open shelves, interspersed with small items of obscurity. Jill started down the hall, stopping briefly at each bizarre spectacle. Skulls, arm and leg bones, hands and feet. There were at least 3 complete skeletons, and amidst the pale and pitted bones were feathers, clay beads, gnarled strips of leather. Jill picked up one of the leather strips and then put it down quickly, wiping her fingers on her pants. She couldn't be sure, but it felt like she imagined tanned human skin would feel, stiff and kind of greasy. The window behind her exploded inward, the lithe, sinewy form lunging into the hall, growling and snapping. It was one of the mutant killer hounds, its eyes as red as its dripping hide. It charged her, its teeth as bright and dangerous as the jagged glitter of glass still falling from the shattered frame. Back between 2 of the chests, Jill fired. The angle was wrong, the bullet splintering the wood at her feet as the dog jumped at her, growling deep in its throat. It hit her in the thighs, slamming her painfully against the wall, gnashing to get its jaws in her flesh. The smell of rotten meat washed over her, and she fired again and again, barely aware that she was moaning in fear and disgust. The sound as guttural and primal as the furious, dying shrieks that came from the canine abomination. The 5th bullet fired directly into its barrel chest, knocking it away. With a final, almost puppyish yelp, it crumpled to the floor, blood gushing into the tan carpet. Jill kept her weapon trained on the still form, gulping in huge, shuddery breaths. Its limbs twitched suddenly, its massive claws beating a brief tattoo across the wet red floor before it lay still again. Jill relaxed, recognizing the movement as a death spasm, the body releasing life. She'd have bruises, but the dog was dead. She brushed her bangs out of her eyes and crouched down next to it, taking in the strange exposed musculature and huge jaws. It had been too dark and hectic on the run to the house to get a good look at the things that had killed Joseph. But in the bright light of the corridor, her initial impression wasn't changed. It looked like a skinned dog. She stood up and backed away warily, eyeing the rows of windows in the hall. Obviously, they offered no protection from the hazards outside. The corridor took a sharp left and she hurried on, past more of the macabre displays that decorated the inner wall. The door at the end of the long hall was unlocked. It opened into another hall. Not as well lit as the first, but at least not as creepy either. The muted gray-green wallpaper sported paintings of generic scenery and gentle landscapes, not a bone or fetish in sight. The first door on the right was locked, a carving of armor on the key plate. Jill remembered the list on the computer, something about night keys, but decided not to bother with it for now. According to Trent's map, there was a room on the other side that didn't lead anywhere. Besides, if Wesker had come this way, she didn't imagine that he was locking doors behind him.
Right. Guess it was unlikely that Chris would disappear. Don't assume anything about this place.
The next door she tried opened into a small bathroom with an antique feel, complete with a ceiling fan and an old-fashioned 4-footed tub. There was no sign of recent use. She stood for a moment in the stale, tiny room, breathing deeply, feeling the aftermath of the adrenaline rush she'd had in the corridor. Growing up, she'd learned how to enjoy the thrill of danger, sneaking in and out of strange places with only a handful of tools and her own wits to keep her safe. Since joining the Stars, that youthful excitement had faded away, lost to the realities of backup and handguns. But here it was again, unexpected and not unwelcome. She couldn't lie to herself about the simple joy that often followed facing death and walking away. She felt good. Alive.
Let's not have a party just yet. Or have you forgotten that stars are being eaten in this hellhole?
Jill stepped back into the silent hallway and edged around another corner, wondering if Barry had found Chris and if either of them had run across any of the Bravos. She felt like she had an advantage with the map, decided that once she'd checked out the possible escape, she'd go back to the main hall and wait for Barry. With the information on Trent's computer, they could search more quickly and thoroughly. The corridor ended with 2 doors facing each other. The one on the right was the one she wanted. She tried the handle and was rewarded with the soft snick of the bolt retracting. She stepped into a dark hall and saw one of the zombies, a hulking, pale shadow standing next to a door maybe 10 feet away. She raised her weapon. The creature started towards her, emitting soft hunger sounds from its decaying lips. One of its arms hung limply at its side, and although Jill could see jagged bone protruding from the shoulder, still clenched and unclenched its rotting fist eagerly as it reached out with its other arm.
The head. Aim for the head.
The shots were incredibly loud in the chilly gloom, the first blowing off its ear, the second and third punching holes into its skull just above its pallid brow. Dark fluid streamed down its peeling face and it fell to its knees, its flat, lifeless eyes rolling back into its head. There was a shuffling movement in the shadows at the back of the hall to the right, exactly where she meant to go. Jill trained the gun on the darkness and waited for it to move closer, her entire body wired with tension.
How many of these things are there?
As soon as the zombie cleared the corner, she fired, the Beretta jumping lightly in her sweating hands. The second shot punctured its right eye, and it immediately collapsed to the dark, polished wood of the floor. The sticky, viscous matter of the blown eyeball flecked across its skeletal face. Jill waited, but other than the spreading pools of blood around the dead creatures, nothing moved. Breathing through her mouth to avoid the worst of the stench, she hurried to the back of the hall and turned right, down a short, tight passage that dead-ended at a rusting metal door. It creaked open, and fresh air flooded past her, warm and clear after the wood-like chill of the house. Jill grinned, hearing the drone of cicadas and crickets on the night air. She'd reached the final leg of her little excursion, and although she wasn't outside yet, the sounds and smells of the forest renewed her sense of accomplishment.
Got a secured path now, straight to the back of this place. We can head north to one of the logging roads and hike down to the barricade.
She stepped out onto a covered walkway, a mosaic of green stones surrounded by high concrete walls. There were small, intermittent openings near the ceiling of the pathway, accounting for the faint pine-scented breeze. Ivy trickled down from the arched openings like a reminder of the outside world. She hurried down the dim passage, remembering from the map that there was a single room at the end to the right, probably a storage shed. She turned the corner and stopped at another heavy-looking metal door, a smile fading as she reflexively reached for the handle. The keyhole was plugged. She crouched and poked at the tiny hole, but to no avail. Someone had stopped it up with epoxy. To the left of the door was some kind of diagram set into the concrete, made of dull copper. There were 4 hexagonal depressions in the flat metal plate, each fist-sized hole connected to the next by a thin line. Jill squinted at the legend etched beneath, wishing that she had a flashlight. She struggled to make out the words. She brushed a thin layer of dust off of the indented letters and tried again. When the sun sets in the west and the moon rises in the east, stars will begin to appear in the sky, and wind will blow towards the ground. Then the gate of new life will open. She blinked. 4 holes.
Trent's list! 4 crests, and something about the gate of new life. It's a combination mechanism for the lock. Place the 4 crests, the door opens. Except that means I have to find them first.
Jill pushed against the heavy door and felt her hope fizzle out completely. Not even a rattle, no give at all. They were going to have to find another way out, unless the crests could be found, which in this place could take years. A lone howl rose in the distance and was joined by the echoing cries of the dogs near the mansion. Strange, yodeling sounds piercing the gentle quiet of the woods. There had to be dozens of them out there. Jill realized suddenly that escaping out the back door probably wasn't such a hot idea. She had limited ammunition for her handgun, no doubt that there would be more ghoulish creatures wandering the halls, shuffling about in hungry, mindless silence as they searched for their next grisly meal. She sighed heavily and started back to the house, already dreading the cold stench of death and trying to prepare herself for the dangers that seemed to lurk at every corner. The stars were trapped. Chris knew he had to make the ammo count, so when he left Rebecca, he took off through the dim corridor at a full run, his boots pounding at the wood floor. There were still only 3 of them, all grouped near the stairs. He dodged past them easily and sprinted down the hall and around the corner. As soon as he got to the door that led back to the other hall, he turned and assumed a classic shooter stance, supporting his gun hand at the wrist, his finger on the trigger. One by one, the zombies reeled around the corner, groaning and stumbling. Chris took careful aim, breathing evenly, keeping his focus. He squeezed the trigger, sending 2 bullets through the gangrenous nose of the first. Without pausing, he sent a 3rd shot into the center of the next zombie's forehead. Fluid and soft matter sprayed onto the wall behind them as the bullets slapped into the wood. Even as they crumpled to the floor, he'd found his mark on the 3rd creature. 2 more muted explosions, and the zombie's brow caved inward, dropping it like the bag of bones that it was. Chris lowered the Beretta, feeling a rush of pride. He was a high-ranked marksman, even had a couple of awards to show for it, but it was still good to see what he could do when given enough time to aim. His quick draw wasn't nearly as strong. That was Barry's forte. He reached for the door handle, urged into action by the thought of all that was at stake. He figured the Alphas could take care of themselves. They had as much of a chance as he did. But this was Rebecca's first operation, and she didn't even have a gun. He needed to get her out. He stepped back into the soft light of the hall with the green wallpaper, quickly checking both directions. Straight ahead, the corridor was in heavier shadow. No way to tell if it was clear. To his right was the door with the sword on the key plate and the first zombie he'd shot, still sprawled lifelessly across the floor. Chris was gratified to see that it hadn't moved. Apparently, headshots were the best way to kill a zombie, just like in the movies. Chris edged towards the sword door, training his weapon left, then right, then left again. He'd had enough surprises for one day. He checked the small offshoot across from the door, seeing that it was clear, quickly inserted the cylinder key into the lock. It turned smoothly. Chris stepped into a small bedroom, only slightly better lit than the corridor, a single bright lamp on a desk in one corner. It was all clear, unless there was something hiding under the narrow cot, or maybe in the closet across from the desk. He shuddered, closing the door behind him. It was every kid's first set of fears, and it had been his too. Monsters in the closet, and the thing that lived under the bed, waiting for a careless child's ankle to come within reach. And you're how old now? Chris shook off the case of nerves, embarrassed at his imaginative wanderings. He walked slowly around the room, looking for anything that might be helpful. There was no other door, no path back to the main hall. But maybe he could find a better weapon for Rebecca than a can of bug spray. Besides an oak table and bookshelf, there was the small, unmade bed and a sturdy desk in the room, nothing more. He quickly rifled through the books, then moved around the foot of the bed to the desk. There was a slim volume next to the desk lamp, a fabric cover untitled, a journal. And although the desktop was coated in dust, the diary had been moved recently. Intrigued, Chris picked it up and flipped to the last few pages. Maybe there was a clue as to what the hell was going on. He sat on the edge of the cot and started to read. May 9th, 1998. Play poker tonight with Scott and Alias from security and Steve from research. Steve was the big winner, but I think he was cheating. Scumbag. Chris smiled a little at that. He skipped down to the next entry, and his smile froze, his heart seeming to pause mid-beat. May 10th, 1998. One of the higher-ups assigned me to take care of a new experiment. It looks like a skinned gorilla. Feeding instructions were to give it live animals. When I threw in a pig, the creature seemed to play with it, tearing off the pig's legs and pulling out the guts before it actually started eating. Experiment? Could the writer be talking about the zombies? Chris read on, excited by the find. The diary obviously belonged to someone who worked here. Had to be. Meaning that the cover-up was even bigger than he suspected. May 11th, 1998. Around 5 a.m., Scott woke me up. Scared the shit out of me, too. He was wearing a protective garment that looked like a spacesuit. He handed me another one and told me to put it on. Said there'd been an accident in the basement lab. I just knew something like this would happen. Those assholes of research never rest, even at night. May 12th, 1998. I've been wearing this damn spacesuit since yesterday. My skin's getting grimy and feels itchy all over. The goddamn dogs have been looking at me funny, so I decided not to feed them today. Screw them. May 13th, 1998. Went to the infirmary because my back is all swollen and feels itchy. They put a big bandage on it and told me I didn't need to wear the suit anymore. All I want to do is sleep. May 14th, 1998. Found another blister on my foot this morning. I ended up dragging my foot all the way to the dog's pen. They were quiet all day, which is weird. Then I realized some of them had escaped. If anybody finds out, I'll have my head handed to me. May 15th, 1998. My first day off in a long time and I feel like shit. Decided to go visit Nancy anyway, but when I tried to leave the estate, I was stopped by the guards. They said the company's ordered that no one leave the grounds. I can't even make a phone call. All the phones have been ripped out. What kind of bullshit is this? May 16th, 1998. Rumors going around that a researcher who tried to escape the estate last night was shot. My entire body feels hot and itchy and I'm sweating all the time now. I scratched the swelling on my arm and a piece of rotten flesh just dropped off. Wasn't until I realized the smell was making me hungry that I got violently sick. The writing had become shaky. Chris turned the page. I could barely read the last few lines. The words scrawled haphazardly across the paper. May 19th. Fever gone, but itchy. Hungry. And eat doggy food. Itchy Scott came. Ugly face so. Killed him. Tasty. 4. Itchy. Tasty. The rest of the pages were blank. Chris stood up and slipped the journal inside his vest, his thoughts racing. Some of the pieces were finally fitting into place. Secret research at a secretly kept estate, an accident in a hidden lab, an escaped virus or infection of some kind that altered the people working here, changing them into ghouls. And some of them got out. The murders and attacks on raccoons started in late May, coinciding with the effects of the accident. Chronology made sense. But exactly what kind of research was being done here? And how deeply involved was Umbrella? How involved was Billy? He didn't want to think about that. But even as he tried to clear his mind of the thought, a new one occurred to him. What if it was still contagious? He hurried to the door, suddenly desperate to get back to Rebecca with the news. With her training, maybe she could figure out what had been unleashed in the secret lab on the estate. Chris swallowed heavily. Even now, he and the other stars could be infected.